on there. Good evening and welcome to the September 28th meeting of the Westborough Planning Board. Before we start, I would like to remind everybody that this Saturday is the Arts in Common Festival on Bay State Commons. I hope you can all attend. It's going to be the best one yet. I would like to read the agenda quickly. We have 3 public hearings on zoning bylaw amendments. One is to see if the town will vote to amend its zoning bylaws by amending the zoning map to rezone that portion of the property located at 64 Otis Street, further identified on the town of Westborough's assessors maps as parcel 25-3A, highway business to general industrial IB. The second bylaw amendment is to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaws by amending the zoning map for properties at 50, 54, 60, and 64 Otis to include those properties in the Industrial D overlay district. And the last zoning bylaw amendment is to see if the town will vote to amend section 3300 subsection 3340 on off-premises signs. We also have some old business to discuss regarding the water loop discussion at the transit-oriented village, and I'd like to take that up first. Tim Kaler is remote this evening. Tim, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Mark, thank you.
I will try to pay attention if you have something to say, or at least acknowledge you if you raise your hand, but this is unusual for me to have you on a Zoom call like this. This hybrid kind of thing is new. What's that?
Try to watch you too.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Just flag me down if he's, ignore him. All right, so the water loop discussion, we've had Farouk Ansari in from Village Commons in the past, and I think you know that Westborough Village has had issues with their water quality, and they've asked the town for some help there, and because it's a private water line, there's not much the town can do, but we...
Mark, could you talk into the...
Yeah, sorry, we've asked Farouk Ansari to see if he could come up with an agreement to do a water loop with Westborough Village and Village Commons. So far, those negotiations have not been successful, and town departments are asking the planning board if they would appoint someone to represent the planning board to, I guess, what's the word, Jim, mediate these discussions?
Yes, to mediate discussions between Westborough Village and Village Commons.
So I'm hoping that we can do that tonight and come back with a potential solution for the planning board to consider and for the town to consider. If anybody wants to volunteer for that, I'm certainly willing to do it, but I don't want to monopolize it.
I have to withdraw myself from that.
I'm aware of that, Pete. Yeah. Anyone else interested? We could probably,
What it was involved.
couple of meetings, yeah.
Probably daytime meetings.
Meetings.
Daytime.
Participating?
I would be there.
Do you want to do it together?
Sure.
Okay, so we can have two members. Hazel, are you in? I think,
Oh,
I didn't
you
know.
need two members?
Well, I'm willing to do it, Jim's willing to do it, but I don't want to monopolize it. So if you or Tim wants to do it,
Yeah, I'll work with Jim on it, it's fine.
okay, so you want to take the lead on it? Okay. All right, I will nominate Jim Ball and Hazel Norris to represent the planning board in these discussions. Do we need a vote on that?
You could, you don't have to, but you could just to memorialize it.
Okay,
Second that.
okay.
Do a second nomination?
You can second your own nomination, sure.
I guess so.
Any discussion? All those in favor, we'll do a show of hands, and Tim Kaler, how do you vote?
Yes, to approve.
Recuse yourself, you can't.
Oh, there you go, sir.
So that's 4-0 in favor of Jim Ball and Hazel to represent us in those. Jim Robbins, just a matter of procedure, does Tim Kaler have to, do we have to do a roll call vote because he's remote, or?
That would probably be advisable because I'm not sure everyone can see him.
Okay, yeah, I don't think people in attendance here can see him. Oh, yeah, they can. So he did say yes. Well, we have 3 more votes to come, probably, so 4 if you count the adjournment later.
I would definitely do a roll call vote on the zoning articles.
Okay, so, all right, so let's turn to the zoning articles. Before we start, I have to read 3 public records into, 3 public notices into the record, which is standard, so bear with me. Notice of the planning board, notice of public hearing. The Town of Westborough Planning Board will hold a public hearing on Tuesday, 28th of September, 2021 at 6:30 PM in the Great Hall, 2nd floor, Forbes Municipal Building, 45 West Main Street, Westborough, Massachusetts, on the following articles to appear on the warrant for the October 21st, 2021 Westborough Special Town Meeting. To see if the town will amend its zoning bylaws by amending the zoning map to rezone that portion of the property located at 64 Otis Street, further identified on the Town of Westborough's assessor's maps as parcel 25-3A from the Highway Business BA zoning district to the General Industrial IB zoning district. To see if the town will vote to amend its zoning bylaws by amending the zoning map designation for properties located at 50, 54, 60, and 64 Otis Street, and further identified on the Westborough's assessor's maps as parcels 26-34, 25-1, 25-3, and 25-3A, to include these properties within the Industrial D Overlay ID District. And to see if the town will vote to amend its zoning bylaws, Article 3, General Regulations, Section 3300, Sign Regulations, subsection 3340, off-premises signs. A copy of each of these proposed zoning amendments is available for review in the Westborough Planning Board offices at 45 West Main Street, Westborough, Massachusetts, and the town clerk's office at 34 West Main Street, Westborough, Massachusetts, during regular business hours, and also on the Westborough Planning Board webpage at www.town.westborough.ma.us/planning. Anyone interested or wishing to be heard on these amendments should attend the public hearing indicated above, and that's signed the Westborough Planning Board, and that was in the Telegram and Gazette on September 10th and September 17th. Bear with me. All right, so Jim Robbins, we'll start with the 64 Otis Street. And I would ask you to address the board first, and then we'll have the proponent come forward.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as you know, we had an informal discussion on this proposal about a month ago, and at that time, what we learned was that the property at 64 Otis Street, further identified as the Westborough Assessor's Map Westborough Assessor's Map 25 as parcel 3A. A portion of that property is zoned highway business, while about 90% of the property is zoned general industrial. The property being bisected by two zoning districts presents a bit of a complication, if not a hardship, for the property in that industrially zoned properties are required to keep a setback or a buffer zone from non-industrially zoned properties, including the highway business district. When the highway business district was formed, a little bit of history, a straight line was drawn from the center line of Route 9, which bisected many parcels along Route 9. As parcel lines changed, some of them changed to track the zoning lines, but some of them, 64 in particular, did not change the parcel line. And since this was a former agricultural use, the underlying zoning didn't matter because you can practice an agricultural use in any district. So the previous user of this property, the previous owner of this property, did not have any limitations caused by the conflict between the two zones. However, the property is proposed to be developed industrially, and the highway business zone would possibly present a hardship and, at the very least, a complexity to the development for that property. It's such a small portion, slightly over an acre on a parcel that has over 36 acres. I would think that it would be only good business for the town to have one zoning bylaw regulating the use of this property and one zoning district governing how the property is used. So I'd recommend that the board hear a presentation from the owner if they wish, but I would recommend that the board support the article as written in the warrant.
Okay. First of all, any questions from the board on that?
All right, so in other words, the only change that we've got, if he's in business district, is the maximum building stories are 2.5 stories, and if he switches to 1B, the maximum building stories are 4. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Other than that, there's no difference between the BA and the 1B.
Some of the uses are slightly different. All of the uses that you can do in BA, you can also do in IB, with the exception you can also do manufacturing.
Just for clarification on that.
Any other questions from the board before we? I personally think this one's fairly simple. We've consistently tried to to clean up split zoned parcels in town. I think it makes perfect sense that 90+% of this parcel is already in IB. Entire parcel be in IB. I think it highlights the need for us to look at other split parcels in town to avoid this conflict in the future. I don't necessarily think we need to go through that process before October, but certainly I'm willing to move forward with this article at town meeting. With the board's pleasure, do we need to hear from the landowner? It is a public hearing, so I'm certainly going to turn to the public for comments, but I don't think we need a presentation on this, do we? Okay. So with that being said, Tim, Kayla, did you have any questions? I wanted to go back to you just to make sure I didn't miss you.
No, Mark.
Okay.
We can proceed without the applicant presenting.
Does the public have any questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. Do we have to close the public meeting first?
You would close the public hearing and make a motion to support the article as written in the warrant.
Well, I'll make a motion to close the public hearing on on the public hearing zoning bylaw amendment regarding 64 Otis Street.
Second that.
Second.
I heard Jim Ball
Oh, sorry.
second first. Any discussion of the motion? All those in favor of closing the public hearing? We'll do a roll call vote, yeah. Jim Ball, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, Tim Kaler, how do you vote? Tim, we're going to do a
Yes.
roll call. Yeah. Pete?
Yes.
Hazel?
Yes.
And I vote yes. That's 5-0 in favor of closing the public hearing. Anyone want to make a motion?
It's a motion.
Your motion.
That the planning board vote to support the zoning bylaw amendment for 64 Otis Street,
I second it.
As written in the warrant?
as written in the warrant.
Second that as well.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Okay, we'll do another roll call vote. All those in favor of supporting the bylaw change for 64 Otis Street? Tim Kaler, how do you vote?
Yes to approve, Mark.
Jim Ball?
Yes, Mark.
Pete?
Yes.
Hazel Nurse?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. That's 5-0 to support. We'll move to the second public hearing, zoning bylaw amendment to see if the town will vote to amend its zoning bylaws by amending the zoning map designation for properties located at 50, 54, 60, and 64 Otis to include those properties within the Industrial D overlay district. Jim Robbins, I'll turn to you first for a summary, and then we'll move forward.
Sure, thank you. As you know, the Industrial D Overlay District exists on the east side of town, on Computer Drive, Research Drive, Freiburg Parkway, West Park Drive, and Technology Drive. The underlying zone is IB, which we discussed earlier. IB allows general industrial uses, including retail, restaurant, office buildings, research and development, and manufacturing. The ID allows all of those uses. The difference between the ID and the IB is the ID allows a more intense and flexible use of the zoning. It allows, instead of a maximum height of 4 stories, a maximum height of 6 stories. Instead of a maximum coverage of 40%, it allows a maximum coverage of 60%. The zoning has been used by several projects already, permitted through site plan review by the planning board on the east side of town. Most recently, the Mass Brigham's partnership on West Park Drive and the Atlantic Management Project at 4400 Computer Drive. I recommend that if the town wishes a specific presentation on the properties which are being discussed, that you turn to the applicant and the proponent of the bylaw.
Yeah, just a question on that real quick, Jim. I thought 4,400 was by right under I didn't.
That 4400 is a by right ID and IB use.
It was, they use the overlay as well?
They can use the overlay.
Just one other thing, I think you didn't mention that open space would drop from 60% to 40%.
That's correct. I said coverage would increase from 40% to 60%, so the open space drops to
Right.
40%.
All right, let's see, any other questions from the board? Tim Kaler, any questions? Okay. All right, I think we have a presentation on this, if I'm not mistaken, or at least someone who wants to address the board on this for the owner.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, Robert Buckley, Reamer and Bronstein. I have with me this evening Joe Zink, the principal of Atlantic Management. What we're trying to do here is to have the flexibility as to incorporate some design flexibility and maybe location flexibility as this side of Otis Street. The Atlantic Management now controls 50 through 64. There's been a lot of development done to date. There'll be some additional development in the future. Two things I'd like to stress. One is, while we're looking for the flexibility, we're not sure that we would proceed under the ID. We just, as we go to the design phase, would like to have that flexibility. Clearly, the board retains the site plan review and jurisdictional issues with respect to the ultimate approval of the site plan. But when you're locating buildings or you're locating, one of the key purposes of your bylaw or the overlay was to facilitate interconnectivity for pedestrians and bicycles. You have a situation here where you have a rail transit station, you have an industrial corridor that's being repositioned, you're taking land that heretofore was, had some environmental issues that's been cleaned up in this process. And to have the flexibility working with the town, not necessarily committed yet that we're even going to need it, but having that flexibility to locate buildings and design a project that has a little more flexibility, we just think makes a lot of sense at this point. Again, we haven't designed it yet, so we don't know, but rather than have that be a criteria that we have to come back in the future when you have a user that wants to proceed, doesn't make a lot of sense in my book when you're trying to design a project that resonates with some of the underlying intent. And again, you retain jurisdiction, you know, as the board, and we've had the experience of going through a number of site plans now on 50, 4400. It's a very thorough process. So the fact that you put the ID in place does not necessarily mean you're going to increase lot coverage. It doesn't mean you're going to increase the height, but it might mean that you can shift a building in the way you've lotted the building or the properties, and maybe in one instance you exceed the 40% and in the other you don't. But it allows you to look at the entirety at once with the flexibility that the ID provides. And you have a unique situation where at the present time you have one owner that owns the corridor or that stretch, and it's a lot easier to deal with one owner and have those planning discussions than it would be if you had 4 or 5 different parcels. So we're just looking for the opportunity to do something flexible.
Okay, let's turn to the board for questions, comments. Who wants to start? Okay, Jim, go ahead.
I don't have any questions. You know, we've discussed this a lot. I understand it. I've looked at the area repeatedly. I'm a fan of economic development. I think we have to do it carefully. I think that the ability to connect these sites for particularly traffic mitigation and entry and exits and things like that is going to be super important here. We've discussed this already. So those are just my primary thoughts. I think trying to maintain open space where we can is going to be important, you know, in the plan. But I do think it's an area where it's a great location for economic development given what's going on there. So those are my thoughts. I don't have any current questions. I know the site well.
All right, any other questions, comments?
I want to reiterate what Jim was saying. I agree. I'm just a little concerned on changing the open space from 40 to 60, or vice versa. So I'm just a little concerned on that. So that's just something I'm going to have to review.
I had a number of questions. My concern at the moment is that Amazon or Atlantic Management, I'm not sure, I know you're the owner and Amazon is running or has its building on there. Amazon at this point has approximately a workforce that's coming into the present property of about 1,100 people. The addition of further buildings on the property owned and probably going to be used by Amazon, we're not sure about. We don't know how many additional buildings, how many additional people that we're talking about that would be using that site. Traffic is a tremendous problem there. It will continue to be a problem. I am uncomfortable at the moment of changing the usage of, or the size of buildings on the property to allow up to 60 feet. I know that you've moved into the new zone, or will if this zoning is passed. It will be 4 stories. I am much more comfortable with a 4-story building there. I also am looking at the property as a whole, And I also look at the viewscape when I'm looking at things. The thought, at the moment, the present building there is approximately, I assume, about 4 stories. Jim, is that about what it is, or Bob? The present new building by Amazon.
It's 2 stories.
It's 2 stories.
Yes.
So even increasing the size and height of a building to 4 stories will be a significant scenic, I guess, picture on that particular street, and the thought of going to 6 stories, I don't think is really appropriate for that property. I think those are my main things. I'm also concerned about the decrease in open space from 60 to 40%. I think it's important that this town maintain as much green space as possible, and I would prefer to not rezone this particular property. We've moved it now into the IB zone, and I think that that's sufficient at this time for any development that could be done.
Mr. Chairman, can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
One of the issues that we're focused on is, as I said, being able to be creative and to use the open space, if needed, to do something other than a square box. Your own bylaw, the ID district, says that in your jurisdiction in reviewing a site plan says that existing mature vegetation is retained. These are findings you have to make in connection with your approval of a site plan. Is retained wherever possible, including winding of sidewalks and creative siting of structures. So without the flexibility to alter on any individual lot the size of a building, you force what I consider vanilla, which is maximize the space by doing a square building. If you have the flexibility of design, you may have a situation where you could have a building that steps up, or the history of this site, at one time you had the pyramid on the site, right? But to have some interesting design attributes to the site. And that's all we're looking for, is the ability to look at those issues as they develop. Again, the board retains their jurisdiction, and the findings that you have to make in connection with the approval under your site plan gives you, I consider, broad power to site buildings, to maintain vegetation. And I think you have to remember that today we already have 50 developed and 64s before this board now. So what we're looking at is that in between space as we put pen to paper, what can we do to make it harmonious and connected?
But you haven't shown us anything that seems as to why there should be an increase from 4 stories to 6 stories.
Well, I'm not saying I'm not even saying we're going to do
That
it.
may be, but at the same time, you have the right to go up that high.
Right. That's
And
correct.
I don't care what the planning board, I mean, we have certain jurisdiction, but at the same time, you will have the right to go up to 6 stories. And I just think that's unneeded on this particular piece. I think your flexibility can be maintained with 4-story buildings. It's a large piece of property, and I would, at this point, would like to see the planning board at least pass over this and have it go back to the planning board for further study, because I think it's inappropriate to move forward at this time. I'd like to know more about the plans that I understand Amazon is looking to set up sort of a campus-type development there. I'd like to know more about that before I even thought about changing zoning on it. I think that you would have sufficient flexibility within the IB zone to carry out what needs to be done.
All right, Hazel, anything else for now?
No.
I want to give Tim a turn. Tim Kaler, do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, Mark. So I believe that this is now a zone commercial industrial. I think the applicant has shown an intent to work with us in funding the corridor study for traffic, and also by looking at supporting the grant to help address the traffic. I think our main issue in this corridor is going to be traffic and traffic mitigation. I think that issue will come before the board every time the applicant seeks to put a new structure up. So I believe our current oversight, to me is an outweighing factor over a change in the overlay. And I'm interested in the interconnectivity of these sites for the applicant and being able to work with them on a flexible basis to design a commercial industrial site that really works for the town, the connections with the rail station, and really addressing the potential growth in the corridor. I'm less concerned with the height restriction of application they have before us at 64 is not at that height, and my guess is that they would maintain the character, but I'd be comfortable that we had the oversight, and I believe that supporting this article allows a level of flexibility to get a better outcome. I would also point out to taxpayers that, any increasing size that we might approve in the future for a building is going to increase tax revenue on a commensurate basis. So it's not just an open book in terms of, a blanket approval for 6-story buildings and maximum 60% usage of the site. In fact, the applicant hasn't shown an intent to look at those limits to date. So for that reason, I'm comfortable with supporting the change.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. So I have a couple of questions and some comments. Jim Robbins, we had asked town council, and I don't know if you had heard about whether, because these parcels are all owned by the same entity, would this be considered spot zoning, or would there be any question of that on the Attorney General's part?
So thank you. The planning board did ask me to reach out to council. I did. He contacted me on Friday and was going to discuss it further with me today. Monday, he did not get back to me. He did not get back to me today either, so I don't have a final answer for you.
Okay. So I certainly would want council's input on that because I don't want to bring something to the town that, isn't legal. But let's move forward with the presumption that it is. My second question, the corridor study, and Bob, you may know the answer to this too. The corridor study that was done and undertaken, we just received the final draft that I have not read all of yet. Did that corridor study factor in development of 6-story buildings and lot coverage of 60%, or was that purely based on current zoning?
So the corridor study is based on the build-out analysis that was done as part of the master plan. And the build-out analysis was based on existing zoning. So it did not include an overlay. So the corridor study would not have envisioned an overlay. It did include, though, the development proposal for 64 Otis Street.
Okay, so that would seem to be maybe, a contradiction there for me, that we undertake a study and then we're going to pass zoning that will affect the outcome of that study. So I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that.
Could I comment on that, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Yeah, Jim is right. You have to look at the current authorized zoning for purposes of the corridor study. But if you look at the corridor study, the proposed development has, under existing zoning, does not come under, it is significantly below the high growth numbers that would be the whole corridor. So our proposal, based upon the ITE estimates of the traffic generated from our site, is significantly below what would be deemed high growth for that property. And again, if we were to come back, you have the jurisdiction on the traffic.
Yeah, but if this were to pass,
Yep.
right, and everything else aside, every other parcel in the district is developed to 4 stories, and you have the ability to go to 6 stories, you would maximize the build-out analysis. You would go beyond the build-out analysis if you built 6 stories and 40% coverage. 40% open space, right? The build-out analysis was based on every parcel in the district
With the
being
most
4 stories or less.
Right, with intensive use, right.
So if you actually built 6-story buildings and everything else was built at 4 stories, that would be over and above the build-out analysis.
Yeah, well,
So I guess
no, I
let's
understand.
simplify it,
I understand the logic, but I think you have to also look at the fact that 2 of the main parcels, 50 and 64, are already built out, and the environmental limitations on the others with respect to the wetlands would limit that maximum build-out that you're. But I understand where you're coming from in terms of the underpinnings of the corridor study. But again, if traffic is an issue, that's in your jurisdiction when we come forward with a proposal.
So, I will address the traffic thing. I think there's 2 ways to look at it. You need to fix the traffic before you do something like this, or if you build it, that will, if you build it, they will come, right?
Well,
Whatever the saying is, field the drain.
I would take a different approach. I don't know how you can fix the traffic before you know what you're going to build.
Right, and I'm a firm believer that we're not going to get the traffic fixed unless we
Know what,
further
unless you know what
demand
is going to be
for a
built.
solution there. So,
Right.
from that standpoint, I'm not uncomfortable with
Right.
approving this change, but I have some other reservations about it. One being, and again, to simplify it for anybody who may not understand my point, if the current build-out analysis says that you can have 1 million square feet, and the corridor study that was done was based on 1 million square feet on all of these parcels, right? And you allow now 6-story even on just a couple of these parcels, you could now have 1,200,000, 1,400,000, whatever the numbers are, I don't know, right? But you could have more than 1 million square feet that may have been the premise. And again, I'm throwing out numbers because I don't know what the premise was, and Jim, you might, but the point is that your maximum build-out is now higher than what was envisioned in that corridor study, and that is something I'd like to see the corridor study address in some way, so that I understand what this change in zoning would do to that maximum build-out, and then therefore to the corridor study. And on top of that, what's that?
Could we ask for an opinion on that? I do agree that the existing developments are.
Jim, can you speak to the mic?
I think because the existing properties that are developed are so far below, but I would imagine we could ask for a follow-up opinion on that, on the study.
Okay, I agree with that, but my next point was, we've already had abutters to this parcel and other landowners in that immediate area who have expressed interest in also going
Correct.
into the overlay. At what point, I know we're talking about 2 parcels now, but should we be exploring, wholesale changes there and the impact of those changes, rather than piecemealing a couple parcels at a time until we create an issue that may be undesirable to the town? So I just want to, I'm just not ready, I'm not really sure I'm ready to sign off on this for that reason.
Could I pose a hypothetical, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Let's take the corridor study that was based on current zoning, high growth, moderate growth, low growth analysis. The current Amazon projects come in below the high growth. The corridor study is a town study that was the underpinnings of the site plan application for 50, which has been built. We at 64, which we have an application before the board now, are considering, and we are designing that project to meet the town's objective on the corridor study. To the extent that we do not comply or advance the objectives of the corridor study, that's a basis for the planning board in their site plan review to insist on or to look at issues that say, okay, tell us why you're not doing this, or we are encouraging you to do this, because we have a corridor study that says this would be the ideal if this project were to, if this corridor were to be developed. How is that different, no matter what the zoning is, if we were to come in with a project under the ID where you have a corridor study that is in place? I believe it's been finalized now, right? Or it's
Say again, Bob?
It's been finalized, or a final
It
draft?
came yesterday.
Right, so that is out there, it's in place. Doesn't that become your operative document to look at a project before you and say, are you advancing the objectives of this corridor study?
Okay, so in response to that, and I don't really want to get into the merits of 64 Otis or not 60, but since you brought it up, one of the points in the corridor study was consolidation of driveways. And your proposal was had no collaboration with 66 Otis. You want us to approve 54 Otis for this, right? Which presumably means another project there. So now we're looking at a driveway at 66, 2 driveways at 64, a potential driveway at 54, and 3 existing driveways at 50. So at what point do we continue to approve these driveways when the long-term goal is consolidation of driveways? And who's going to, that doesn't seem like good planning to me. And I would expect, when we have a chance, particularly with one landowner who owns this much, to have that landowner come up with a proposal that looks towards long-term goals for the town and collaboration and what makes sense, right? And so I would have expected you to come up with a solution where all of your properties consolidated driveways, not creating 6, 7, 8 driveways in addition to not even working with 66, who you could have piggybacked that all into one.
Well, first of all, on that comment on 66, that recently traded. They weren't the owners. There were public hearings that were held on the corridor study, and they were, a lot of the owners on that corridor participated in those discussions. They recently bought that site, it's my understanding. They or their predecessor, I don't know if the predecessor participated on those discussions. So the seller should have told the buyer what was going on. I mean, we had no knowledge, and if anyone on this board can attest or agree on one thing, we're willing to work and to discuss issues. And had we known that it had traded, we probably, during that discussion, those public forums, we would have explored that. The reason we have that one driveway is a limited driveway for safety purposes, and we did redesign our site to have the lights, but I don't want to do.
Bob, I feel like we're getting sidetracked to
Right, I agree.
a site plan review that we're going to take up at a future meeting. But my point being that I feel like, we have this corridor study. We should hold those, recommendations in the corridor study in mind when we make decisions. And one of those decisions, and now I feel like this zoning change might make some of the premises that corridor study was based on, if not obsolete, somewhat short of what was expected when they did the corridor study. So, or long, if that's a word, I don't know. And also, do we look at the abutting owners and whether there's merit for abutting parcels to be included in this type of change? Because I don't think just one landowner should benefit from a zoning change. I think zoning changes should be driven by an area where we want to either encourage growth or we see a need.
Mark, 66 is asked to be included in this now, is that correct?
Right.
66 is asked to be included in this?
Yes, we received an email from the owner of 66 requesting to be included, and the owner also stated that neighbors across the street at 53A and B wish to be considered.
Okay. Now, the other point I wanted to make, and So, I've been on the board the longest here, and other than Jim. So when we've long, as a board, tried to encourage commercial and industrial development in town to the point where we changed bylaws to allow trails to be included in open space. We allowed detention basins to be included in open space. And one of the, and then we passed the overlay, right? And the overlay was originally a special permit, right? We didn't change the IB zone to allow 6 stories and 60% lot coverage. We put an overlay in, which meant that, there were things that needed to be met by a developer in order to get the benefits of that overlay. Well, one of the criticisms we had was that they needed certainty. A special permit was not a definitive enough process for a potential project, and they needed to know that it was by right zoning. So we changed it to by right zoning, but we didn't take any of the conditions that we would normally get in a special permit and carry it into the by right overlay zoning. And so I don't really understand, there's not a huge difference between the IB zoning and the ID overlay. They're both by right. The only real condition you have to do to meet the ID overlay is to build a more environmentally friendly building. But it doesn't give us room, the advantages of a special permit is that it gives us room to discuss mitigation. And, in exchange for taking advantage of the relaxed zoning, right, a special permit, we could negotiate mitigation and say, okay, if you want to go to 6 stories, that's a more dense project, or if you want to go to, 40% open space, that reduces your open space. So maybe as part of a special permit, you could ask them to make a contribution towards open space somewhere else in town. Well, we don't have any of that built into the overlay zoning at all, right? So as I've come to find out in negotiating with developers, it's really hard to get mitigation unless it's built in, right? And I think we need to look at that overlay and say, well, okay, it's not, if it's by right zoning, that's fine, but it's in order to get the advantage of that relaxed or, increased coverage or whatever, you need to do a little more than you would under the base zoning. If you don't need to do more, then why isn't it just the base zoning? Why don't we just change the IB to 6 stories? And I'm sure you guys would love that, but is that kind of, why do we have 2 separate zonings there? If there's not a reason that it's an overlay, and the reason is that we should, as a town, factor in what is the impact of that increased lot coverage and of that increased story height, and what do we as a town need to make that more a better project, right? In order to succeed, for that project to succeed, not just for the developer, but for the town, is there something we need to build into that zoning, whether it be traffic mitigation, sewer and water mitigation, open space mitigation, whatever it might be. I'd like to spell that out in the overlay zoning so that a developer has an expectation and the town has an expectation before we approve something in that zone. So my feeling is it's premature to move this forward to town.
I understand where you're coming from, but I will say this, and I'm not speaking for my client, although I think I'm safe in saying this, that in the projects that we've come before this board on site plan as of right uses, there's been substantial mitigation paid or done.
Bob, I'm not arguing that, okay?
So
But
what I'm saying is that-
What I'm saying is, we need to improve the zoning so that any developer, not just
Right.
you, right? Because, I understand that you've been forthcoming with mitigation, right? But so that any developer looking at this zoning has an expectation of what mitigation they will need to factor in when they take advantage of this overlay, right? And that's,
No,
that's, like, I don't want it.
I understand the argument.
And it's more importantly for me, so the town can expect
Right.
that the town will know what to expect if the planning board approves a project under this overlay. The town will know what to expect for mitigation.
Yeah, I would submit two things. One, the current marketplace has changed dramatically, and the address is no longer the driving factor. You know, there was a time when you had to be in Kendall Square, or you had to be in Westborough, or you had to be in Marlborough, or you had to pick a community because there was a cachet, there was a cluster, there was something that you said, we have to be there for our business plan. And you were willing to, whatever the mitigation was, whatever you deal with a special permit, the discretionary grant. Those days are gone right now. What happens in the marketplace today is how quickly can we get into a location to get our product under development into market, and can we grow? And can we keep our critical asset, which is employees, happy, wealthy, and wise, for lack of a better term? And developers or users will say, it's a great site, but we can't wait 18 months. We can't wait a year because our competitors, our market, whatever it is, demands that we move quickly. I would also submit that if you look at your site plan rules and regulations or your existing zoning, the preamble to your ID zoning provides findings or the purpose of the ID zoning in terms of interconnection, environmental sensitivity, a lot of things that give you a lot of wiggle room that when an applicant comes before you are very akin to a special permit. Very akin, because the applicant has to demonstrate that the application of the ID zone in this instance is appropriate because you've addressed a number of the criteria that we as a board are supposed to consider. So the debate, the mitigation, the development are there. What is different in today's world is that communities are at a disadvantage if they make things special permit or not as of right. I would also submit that in the final analysis, when you go through the whole process, other than that magic word, the discretionary grant, discretionary permit, there's really no difference. The amount of engineering, the amount of negotiation, the amount of mitigation on a good development is the same.
So I'm not suggesting that we go back to special permit,
Yeah.
right? What I'm suggesting is that I'm not ready to move this forward until I feel, because I feel like there's flaws in the overlay even where it currently exists, right? So I don't want to take what I consider, I don't want to say flawed, but I think it could be improved, right? And I don't want to take that and move it over here until I'm confident that it's the best product we can bring to the town meeting. And I also want to look at whether other parcels in this area should benefit from this change. And I want to hear, what the impact on the corridor study was. So for that reason, I feel like it's premature, and I'm uncomfortable bringing it to this fall town meeting, but I would like to explore it more. And, again, I don't know what more I can say. I mean, I've taken up a lot of time already, so I'd like to give Jim Robbins a chance to comment, and then we'll turn to the public. Peter, I'm sorry, did I skip over you?
Go ahead, Peter.
You're all set.
Thanks.
Okay.
Jim Robbins, go ahead.
We need to throw it open to the public, but I think that the chairman made a lot of good points. And my biggest concern is now that the abutters have asked to be included in this consideration. And at the last meeting, at your last public hearing, when you opened the hearing for 66, they had a lot of concerns for the corridor study. They wanted to understand how the corridor study impacted their access, impacted the front of their property because they have mature trees that they would now lose by a new sidewalk and a new multi-use path. And now they would also like to have the opportunity to increase their density on their property because they know they're going to need more parking in the very near future. And I think that that's a wise thing. And other abutters are also interested but don't have enough information. And I don't know if there's anyone in the room tonight from 53 Otis, A or B? Right there. You'll want to call on them when the opportunity comes to advise you.
Yeah, we're going to turn to the public in a second. I just wanted to see if you had any other comments. Okay. All right, so if we're going to turn to the public now. If anybody from the public wishes to speak, raise your hand and I'll call you up to the microphone, and you'll just need to state your name and address for the record. Okay, sir, why don't you start?
I'm Steve McRadichian, partners, property on the east side of Otis Street. We own property at 49 Otis. We own properties at 53 Otis. And firstly, I'd like to compliment and applaud the board's position on this issue. Firstly, a couple points of interest. Atlantic Management is not the only landlord. We own several parcels. I know 55 Otis Street, adjacent to us, is owned by a different entity. And I think you've already eloquently stated that this overlay district is going to happen. Should it happen, it should be inclusive. It should be equitable. It should be inclusive. All the way down to the end of Otis Street. What's good for Atlantic Management should be good for. Lastly, I'd just like to make a comment. Spot zoning, I'm not an attorney in the Commonwealth, but spot zoning is illegal.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, this is not spot zoning.
Okay. Well, I'm still waiting for
You can
our
wait for your town
counsel
council to give that, but this is not spot zoning.
Bob, I do have confidence in your legal knowledge, but I still would prefer that our counsel.
And as you should.
Anyone else from the public? Jody, you want to come up?
Jody Hensley, 39 Arch, and I've given this quite a bit of thought over the last week, so I'm going to consult some notes as I go along. I believe the proponent here can succeed with current zoning, and Amazon is currently complying, as are many companies up and down in that zone. 2 years ago, this zoning change was proposed. I was sitting on the Advisory Finance Committee at that time. And we opposed it for a number of reasons, mostly because it's inappropriate for the west side of town. It's right near gateways into residential neighborhoods. It's a sensitive environmental area. Viewscapes would be impacted, and roadways there are problematic. This change was made on the east side of town, which has none of the problems that I just mentioned here. I think the town decided to make this change on the east side in a commercial area that was separated from neighborhoods with small roadways. Flexibility we're talking about here tonight means that a project can and will be developed with 60% coverage of the site by impervious surfaces. And I think I'm just going to zone in on what this means for open space and green space and ecological priorities in the community. I think if we approve, open up the door to moving from 40% coverage with impervious surfaces to 60% coverage, those are the projects that are going to be brought before you. Those are the projects that are going to be invested in, and planning boards going from now well into the future are going to be facing those. This is a legacy decision you're making here. You're making a legacy decision about whether we'll preserve our commitment to keep 60% of our lands in this area as open space in order to cope with the paving over and building on 40% of those parcels. I think creative commercial campus planning can be done, preserving 60% open space and with 40% impervious surfaces, and that's pavement or buildings. We talked here tonight a little bit about mitigation for lost green space. I think that's a very important consideration. I don't even know how you do the calculation for how you make up for every acre of green space that becomes impervious space and is no longer ecologically viable. All of that impacts the carbon footprint of the town, and the environmental realities now are much more pressing than they ever have been before. Our experience with Westborough over 317 years, eventually business comes. We have the sixth largest commercial contribution to our tax base of any municipality in the Commonwealth. We are blessed with a location with major thoroughfares through, and we succeed commercially here. We always have, we always will. But our residents are still the largest taxpayers in town. And the voice of the residents who came here for a particular reason have to be considered when we make these planning decisions too. And it's the quality of life here and the quality of resources here that have brought many, many families here to invest their life and several generations of their families. So I reached back to the folks who are on the planning board to find out when we came up with this bylaw that seeks to preserve 60% open space and allows 40% coverage of a parcel with impervious surfaces, and was told this happened in the late 1970s, and it was a planning board who looked at all the lands that were going to be established as with industrial zoning. They looked up and down Route 9, and they thought about what Westborough had and what Westborough wanted to preserve that other communities up and down the corridor did not preserve. So they were thinking ahead from the 1970s to now, and that's why I remind you, you're making a legacy decision when you consider giving away another 20% of these developable lands to impervious surfaces. So the vision was that Westborough would maintain its lush green footprint and its pleasing viewscape. For every 5 acres of an industrial build-out, 2 of those acres would have a surface built on and paved over, with 3 of those acres preserved as green space, thereby balancing the ecological impact and maintaining the balance in favor of the ecological process of stormwater filtering and naturally unrestricted soils. It was lots of concerns about the water table and the aquifer and limiting the spread of these impervious surfaces with an excess of concrete and asphalt. But I'm not going to speak to viewscape and building heights. That's when I think of, on balance, all the factors that are being considered with a change here to meet economic realities. It's the green space. It's keeping the green footprint that matters most to me. If you were looking at 90 acres of developable land over there, and we currently want to keep 60% of it green and 40% of it impervious, that means 54 of those acres would be green and natural, and 36 of those acres would become impervious or paved. 3 acres remain open to offset every 2 acres of impervious newly paved acreage. If we make the change that's proposed in this zoning change, we potentially lose another 18 of those 90 acres. It becomes 56 of those acres paved over, and only 36% of those acres, 36 of those acres left open to deal with the ecological impact, to offset the ecological impact of new development. So I remind you that the value of open and natural green space has to do with air quality. It has to do with water quality. It is connected to climate and global warming. It provides carbon sequestration. It provides cooling and heat waves. There's biodiversity that's supported there, and there's even psychosocial and mental health and wellness impacts connected to keeping more green space in play as you develop. I think this can be done creatively. I think it's going to be imperative that business in the future develop in a more green way. I also want to say I didn't see any requirement for green roofs, which could could take the green footprint that gets covered on the ground and put it on the roof. Yeah, that's being successfully deployed in many, many places. So I guess I'm just here to speak, to remind you what your elders did a generation ago in the 1970s, what their vision was for this community, and maybe to get you to think hard, which I think I can tell, Mark, you're already thinking hard about the trade-offs that have to be made here. I also came off of 2 years on the master plan right now, where we've just delivered a new master plan where economic development was one of the chapters, but 6 of the 7 of the other chapters, the recurring theme was maintaining our natural environment here, maintaining the livability, maintaining biodiversity, having spaces to recreate, and sustainability of our environment was a value through and through that master plan. So I'd think carefully. I would encourage our commercial partners in Westborough to, I think we could come to the table and operate on the same set of values and have thriving industry and commerce, as well as remembering the values of the residents who've lived here for a generation, have wanted to keep it green while we grow. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking my comments.
Pete, come on.
Thank you. Pete Dunbeck, 8 Wayside Road. I appreciate Jody's comments and feel I support all of those comments. My overriding issue, kind of walking in here this evening, was the 40-60 balance of the property as I understood it. As I listened to the discussion, I also became quite concerned about how this seems to be getting rushed in very close to town meeting without a time for proper vetting and review. The uncertainties in regard to town council on spot zoning and these new landowners coming into potentially the same question, questions about the traffic corridor study and so forth. It seems that there hasn't been proper vetting of this idea, and I'd recommend not going forward to town meeting at this time and having a proper review of it, because I'm excited about Amazon and the development that's going on along there. I think it's quality work. I think it's a great opportunity for the town overall. But just this feels like it's kind of getting rushed and jammed in before the fall town meeting here.
Thanks, Pete. Anyone else from the public? Do we have any comments by mail or email?
Mr. Chairman, before you close, can I make one comment?
Just 1 second, Bob. Kristen, do we have any email or any other correspondence on this, department comments?
I have none.
Bob, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will point out for the board's knowledge that I'm sure you're aware that one of the findings you have to make is that any approved project incorporates the best practices of energy efficient design, environmental protection, stormwater management, leadership or lead in energy and environmental design, criteria for low-impact development techniques wherever possible. So you have broad authority in anything that comes before you to address many of those issues. And I would just like the record to show I'm not worried about spot zoning. I'm sure your town council will tell you the same, that because I think I provided some case law for you on that too. So. But I understand where you're coming
Bob,
from.
one of the things I like about the ID overlay is the best practices towards environmentally friendly construction. So, that's certainly something I think is a bonus for the overlay. I guess I'm just uncomfortable, and I can't speak for the rest of the board, but I'm uncomfortable going to town meeting and supporting this. I'd like to look at a lot of factors first before I bring it to the town. So if there's no other public comments, anything else from the board before we continue?
I just want to make one comment. Normally, when we look at a zoning change, we spend quite a lot of time looking at it and its effects on the zoning code itself and on the community and what's best for the community. And I think Mr. Dunbeck really made the right comment in the fact that this seems to have been rushed through. We did not get it until August, maybe early September for the new town meeting in October. I don't think we, or myself, even as a board member, have had the time to really think of what all the effects would be of making this particular change. And so I, again, am uncomfortable about going through and taking this to town meeting at this particular time, as I think it needs a significant amount of study before we move forward.
Mr. Chairman, I just confirmed with my client, I firmly believe that this ID zoning overlay provides a valuable planning tool. You may want to tweak it, and I think your comments are well received. If I could suggest that rather than deny and take a potential development option off the table that you may be able to use in approving projects, or maybe even looking at the corridor, and if others desire to participate, which is always their right, I don't think we'd be adverse to having it referred to the planning board if that's your recommendation for further study. And we would try to work over the next couple of months to try to address with you and others some of your issues, because I do think, you know, economic development is not the way it was done 20 or 30 years ago. As anyone who watches this board go through some of the projects I've been involved with, it's intense. You have good planning. It's good. It's environmentally sensitive, because I've spent 2 days, so I didn't walk through the woods, but I know others did. There are a lot of things that have happened here. And as I've said, I think I said before the select board, you have what others desire, which is you have a rail transit station, you have the opportunity to eliminate vehicular traffic, you have everything working for you. Why not be creative and be flexible going forward? So rather than throw it out, I'd rather work it through and see if we can come up with something, at least with respect to us. I can't speak for others who may want to participate.
Bob, I'm not by any means suggesting that we recommend the town defeat the proposal. I just feel like it needs more study, and I think that, in my opinion, the best recommendation to the town is to refer it back to the planning board for more study. I do feel like there's improvements to be made, study, you know, certainly questions. Again, I don't want to speak for the rest of the board, but, you know, I think there's obviously a demand for some zoning changes over there, at least from the landowners in that area. And I am all for a zoning change that might help those landowners either value or drawing new projects or new developers, right? But I just need to make sure that any zoning we pass is also going to be protective of the residents. So I just feel like we need to look at it a little more and figure out what the best solution is to balance those needs, right? I mean, there's two sides, probably more than two sides to this coin, right? And I just want to make sure that we look at it from every angle before we bring it to the town. Any other comments from the board? Tim, do you have anything else?
No, I was going to make a motion to close the public hearing, so we could
Okay.
entertain return to study. I'm assuming that's what we need to do.
Okay, well, we have to close the hearing first. So Tim made a motion to close it. Jim Ball seconded it. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor of closing the public hearing, we'll do a roll call. Tim Kaler?
Yes.
Jim Ball? Yes. Pete Bouchard?
Yes.
Hazel Nurse?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. That's 5-0 to close the public hearing. And Tim, did you have another motion you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was going to make a motion that when you pass over this article, is referring it so that it can be returned to the planning board for further study.
Tim, can I suggest that we don't have the authority to pass this over at town meeting, but we can make a recommendation to the town meeting? Jim Robbins has a draft motion, so maybe one of us could read the motion and you can second it, if you so choose. Jim Ball, why don't you go ahead?
That would be great. I move that the planning board recommend to the town meeting voters that the article be referred to the planning board for further study.
Second.
And I'll second that motion.
Okay, Hazel beat you to it, Tim, sorry. It's the advantage of being in person.
Thanks, Hazel.
All right, any discussion of that motion? All right. All those in favor of recommending that the town refer this back to the planning board for study? Jim Ball?
Yes.
Tim Kaler?
Yes.
Pete Bouchard?
Yes.
Hazel Nurse?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. That's 5-0. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you for your time and
I greatly
consideration.
appreciate it. We have one more public hearing tonight. To see if the town will vote to amend its zoning bylaws, Article 3, General Regulations, Section 3300, Sign Regulations, subsection 3340, off-premises signs. Jim Robbins, I'm going to turn to you again to summarize this, and then I believe we have someone here for the proponent to address the board. So,
Yes, 1 second.
Yep.
Joe, why don't you sit there, and I know Mike is going to, if you're going to make a presentation, you can connect here.
Okay.
Okay. So, Joe, I'm going to give the same introduction that I gave at the Selectmen earlier this evening, if that's okay.
I'll be as impressed as last time.
So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the town currently has a bylaw, a zoning bylaw, that allows billboards. That does not allow billboards. However, as you know, we have a billboard at the Cumberland Farms property because we had a pre-existing non-conforming sign on that property. The property owners went to the Zoning Board of Appeals and were approved to have that billboard converted to a digital billboard. The applicant for that was Clear Channel, who's here this evening. The state has a permitting process for electronic billboards or any signage along the state routes and state-governed highways. That includes Route 9, and we have several electronic billboards currently in Route 9 that at one time were paper billboards, and they now have electronic faces to them. The billboards have not been relocated, the height hasn't changed, the size hasn't changed, just the electronic media on the billboard has been changed. Currently, the state has a permitting process that requires a separation of 1,000 feet between parcels that have electronic billboards that face the right-of-way of the Mass Pike, 495, or Route 9. The minimum separation being 1,000 feet would mean that you couldn't have two billboards within 1,000 feet of each other or within the intersection of any of those roads. So as you know, we have an intersection of Mass Pike and 495 in Westborough. We also have the intersection of Route 9 in 495 in Westborough. So that significantly limits the number of properties that front on one of those roads from being the location of an electronic billboard. The proposal that you have in front of you proposes size, height, and dimensional setback for electronic billboards. In addition, one criteria that I didn't mention, that Joe mentioned in the earlier meeting, is that any electronic billboard needs to have a separation setback of at least 200 feet from any residential district. So not only do they need to be at least 1,000 feet apart, but they need to be 200 feet from any residential district. Informally, this proposal was presented to the planning board about a month ago, and then the applicant came back a couple weeks ago and provided you with further information, including a map showing the parcels that fronted on 495 and Route 9 and what a 1,000-foot separation would look like. Since that time, the applicant has provided us with a video showing how the billboards have functioned in other communities, along with testimonials from the communities as well as from businesses that use the billboard. So I think that's a pretty good introduction for you, Joe.
Very good, thank you. I'm Joseph Jenkins, and I represent Clear Channel in this instance, who are petitioning to have the warrant placed on the town meeting, or have their this proposal placed in the town meeting, and we seek the planning board's approval for that. We've worked now for a couple months and tried to refine the language in a way that the planning board might find acceptable. And certainly, we're open to further discussion about any changes. I know that the height, we're still working on detailing exactly what the height limitation would be. I thought that was one open issue that we might be able to conclude this evening. We do have the testimonial from the other community. I don't know if the planning board's watched it or would like to watch it. And we also have a slideshow that I think the planning board may have seen before, indicating some sampling of what the billboard faces might look like. And as they do look in the town of Westborough already, because the town has a digital billboard now, which Clear Channel operates, and the town, and that's on Route 9, and the town, as Mike reminds me and likes to say, is the biggest content user in the state as far as utilizing the electronic billboard to its maximum advantage in communicating with the town and promoting different functions and ideas, and working with law enforcement as well. Would you like to see that testimonial from the other community? It's about 3.5 minutes long.
How does the board feel about that?
I don't think we need to.
I would like to have you do the presentation, just only because this is a public hearing and the public may not have seen that at the prior meeting. I know the board has, but why don't we move forward with that, if that's all right?
Tip was generated because of a color photograph on a Clear Channel billboard.
I'm Charlie Dare from Commonwealth Motors. I've used outdoor advertising for years and years now, but I've got to tell you, with the emergence of digital, it's just incredible. We can instantaneously change things. The manufacturer sends us a special in the morning. I can have that up in an hour or two. We've got stuff up for the weekend, and the response is tremendous. I love it.
One of the greatest aspects of this is the benefit that all of the nonprofits share in the community. It's educational programs, support for the seniors, support for Little League teams, hockey teams. And if they were not electronic, we couldn't turn them over as quickly as we do to meet everybody's needs for their specific cause.
My name is Susan Zucker. I am the president of the Conquer Cancer Coalition of Massachusetts. So proud to say we have about 5,000 Conquer Cancer plates on the road. When people called, the majority of them would say, I saw a billboard on the highway and I knew I wanted to be part of that effort. The colors are amazing and the light is amazing. I'm so excited when I see it because it just jumps right out at you, and we're so grateful to Clear Channel for all they've done.
My name is Ashley Hasiotis. I'm the president of One Mission. Our event, the Kids Cancer Buzz Off, is a really super fun, cool event. We get participants to shave off their hair to help children and the families living with pediatric cancer at the hospital. The first year we had 21 participants, and last year we shaved 450 heads. The gross revenue from that event the first year was $34,000, and last year, 2012, we did just over $600,000.
We have tremendous support from everybody who's used it, from the Jingle Bell Festival here, to the historic community, to the Rotary Club, and so many more. It's a real positive effect on the quality of life in the community.
This wouldn't happen without Clear Channel and digital billboards, so thank you.
So perhaps also we could show the slides of what typical ads would look like that might be featured on the billboard. And I don't think this has sound, but it does show that the billboard can be used for breaking news. Law enforcement will be able to utilize the board, as well as emergency services. And that content can be spread over into charitable uses as well, as the town sees fit to spread their content around from time to time.
There's one more slide.
And of course, the zoning article itself only permits this to be approved by the Board of Selectmen on a case-by-case basis. So it only opens up the possibility of an additional electronic billboard along the highway districts. Perhaps, maybe we should show the map too, because there's not that, the parcels that are affected are the ones in solid yellow. So the solid yellow parcels are candidates for a possible electronic billboard, although this doesn't take into account the fact that some are too close to that interstate exchange on the my right side of the screen. So probably those parcels also are not eligible. So really it's the ones that, as you proceed left and on the top side of the screen, that are actual candidates for a billboard under this proposal. And of course, that would have to be approved by the Board of Selectmen. The contract would have to be approved, the location and the dimensions as well. And they'd have to all be under the general specifications that we've listed in the warrant, which were parroted from the state specifications. So we're hopeful the planning board will support our article as it's placed in front of the town meeting in October.
Okay. All right, Joe, why don't we turn to the board for questions, and then we can get to the public. Any questions from the board? Hazel, go ahead.
Yeah, excuse me, I had a few questions. Firstly, all the properties that are in yellow that look like the possibilities, are those pretty much under the same ownership?
No, we had to give certified mail to all the owners, and there was quite a stack, quite a listing. Some are under common general ownership, my client Caruth being one of them, perhaps. But although I can give you the list, if some are owned by the state, Westborough Group, Microchem, an individual, Cumberland Farms, Town of Westborough, 4,400.
Could you show me on
Park
this?
Central.
All right, could you show me on this map as to where, I mean, my understanding is there may only be one place in which you could actually locate this particular billboard. Is that correct?
I don't think that's correct. I think what I've learned is if one is approved, there probably can't be two. Because if one is approved, and I think it could be approved on any of the 10 or so or 13 parcels on the top left of the screen, but if one is approved, then the distance requirement between the billboards would probably eliminate any other lot.
Yeah, that's not the question I asked you. I asked you which properties, we know, and my understanding is that you can probably only put one billboard on any one of these yellow properties. I mean, in other words, you have a limited place in which you can place this particular billboard.
I would think that any of the lots on the top left, all of those are big enough to accommodate an electronic billboard.
But
if you're asking me if in reality only one lot can meet the definition, I don't believe that's true.
Well, my question is, I really would be interested to know whether there was more than one lot which could meet this particular setbacks and height restrictions and would cover the sight line, which I understand your client is looking for. Because I am concerned about the fact that to change this zoning, which might only benefit one property owner, which I don't think is an appropriate change in zoning.
Well, I think what he's saying, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that all these properties would benefit, but once one of them put a sign up, that benefit would go away for the rest. So I guess it's a race at that point.
Mark, because of the configuration of the roadway,
right,
and how it sits, and the fact that there may be only one possible spot where this particular sign can go. And that's why I really would like to know where this could go, because I am concerned about the benefit really may only be to one property owner by changing this zoning.
Let me speak?
Okay.
Oh, it's loud.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So if you look at the intersection between Route 9 and Route 495, the top right, if you start from there and go all the way down to the Pike, there's probably 3 or 4 locations that would meet the criteria. But like we mentioned, if one billboard was approved, then that would negate the other locations because of the 1,000-foot spacing rule. So there are other potential properties that could get developed for the billboard.
That really does sense. Not terribly, but I will let that pass for the moment. I had a second question was, I'm also concerned about actually the placement of where this would be. I think we've got a real problem with the intersections, which we have at Route 9, and putting a billboard up, which may affect people driving up and down 495. I mean, one of the purposes of a change in this type of zoning would be to benefit the town. I mean, this is one of the reasons that you change zoning is to benefit the town as a whole.
The purpose of any zoning.
Exactly. All right. So my concern is that if you are driving, the Route 9 intersection going north is very difficult. If you're trying to get off onto Route 9, if you're driving north on 495. All right, if we have a billboard, whether this is going to interfere for safety aspects, therefore I think it's something that needs to be considered as far as where a placement of a particular billboard would be. I guess, and there's also obviously a freedom of speech thing that any town should be aware of the fact that because of freedom of speech, we have no control over what can go on that particular billboard. I would like to see this passed over also, or deferred to a later time in order to do some more studying on the advantages to changing the zoning to what benefits it would actually be to our particular town.
All right, so did you want to respond to that?
As to the Route 9, proximity to Route 9, I believe, and Mike can speak to it probably more eloquently than I, but I think there's a restriction about being within 500 feet of that intersection.
Correct. There's a state rule that states you can't be within 500 feet of an on or an off ramp.
No, I
Electric billboard.
understand that, but that particular intersection is really difficult for people going north. And
Okay,
anyway, as
No,
I
I
said,
agree with you
my
that-
general argument.
I agree with you about that intersection, but I also think 500 feet is a substantial distance. So, again, I'm, everyone has to draw their own conclusions on whether that's far enough. But any other questions or comments from the board?
What's the height of the sign on Route 9 currently?
On Route 9?
Our two locations or Cumberland Farms?
Your location.
One, I believe, is 50, and I believe the other is 40 feet high.
Yeah, so this sign would be 75 feet high, which is drastically higher than Route 9, So, if that one's set further back from an intersection, right, because it's also lower, so it's going to be less distracting. But if, it's going to be 75 feet, it's going to be more distracting from a further distance. So it's just something to consider.
So when we say 75 feet, that's the overall height, but because the grade of the property is below the height of the roadway, it's only about 40 feet above the roadway. So on Route 9, we're to grade with the roadway, so that's why if the sign's 40 feet high, it's 40 feet high above the roadway because it's flushed, you know what I mean, with the grade?
How tall is the one on Cumberland Farms, do you know?
That one, I believe, is 75 feet to the top, and that's almost flush to grade.
Okay, any other questions or comments from the board?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Tim, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so question for the applicant. In your prior presentation, the Mass DOT had limit for signage in terms of space, height and view angle. Is that correct?
They don't have a limitation on the height of a sign. That's regulated by the local community.
So there is no DOT height restriction on billboards. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Or view angle?
I'm sorry?
Or height from view angle?
No.
There's neither restriction by the state in the overall height of the sign from grade or the height from the view angle of the highway. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. That's regulated by the local community.
Okay. Mr. Chair, this was another article that I asked the town council to review for spot zoning. Do we have a ruling from them on that?
Jim Robbins, any response?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have not heard back from our town council on the spot zoning question on either this article or the previous article. But one thing to respond to Mike's comment, I did ask the state for the permitting restrictions on the Cumberland Farm sign. And I don't know if your understanding is that the state, in this case, makes up their mind based on the proposal, because they did cap the height of that sign, and we don't have a bylaw in place. So for the Cumberland Farm sign, the height from the ground to the top of the sign is 75 feet. The height from the road elevation that the sign is intended to face to the top of the sign is 70 feet. So I imagine it'll be whichever is higher. And so if you were to proceed with this to town meeting, I'd recommend that you make those criteria your maximum height of a sign.
We don't currently have in the proposed bylaw a height restriction, and you're recommending that we add that?
Not on these, because we don't allow digital billboards. I mean, we don't allow billboards or off-premises signs,
In the
period.
proposed bylaw?
In the current bylaw, we don't allow
Here is 90
off-premises
feet,
signs.
And you're recommending that it be lowered to, so in the proposed bylaw, there's a 90-foot height restriction.
Yes.
And you're recommending that it be lowered?
Yes, that we track the state language, which would be the height from the ground to the top of the sign, 75 feet, the height from the road elevation that the sign is intended to face to the top of the sign would be 70 feet. So there's a reason for those two distinctions, because if the road elevation is at ground elevation, then the height of the sign is 75 feet. If the road elevation is different than the ground elevation, then the height of the sign is 70 feet. That makes a difference in this case because that roadway is elevated.
So Tim, did you, I don't know if everyone else understood that, but I just want to make sure Tim heard that the proposed bylaw does have a height restriction?
Yeah, I heard the response.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, you just make my comments and then we can move on. I don't think that we're passing judgment on whether we should have billboards or not in town. I was going to support this because it allows a private property owner to exercise, private property owners in that commercial area to exercise this opportunity. And two, because it provided both tax revenue to the town and the public service time on the sign. I don't think that would have been persuasive to me before a couple of recent incidents where I know how impactful it was. So I think I was inclined to support this. Wanted to think by town council that this wasn't spot zoning. I guess I'm now concerned that the applicant didn't come in with height restrictions, and there seems to be a condition of what the state would allow, since so much of the original presentation, because this is on a state highway, goes to the limitations that the state would provide. So it seems to me that any rewrite or change should be within the envelope of what the state is allowing. And, I would, at this point, probably vote for passing it over as well, just due to these open questions. So I'll leave it at that.
I would just say that the height limitation that we put in was
Go ahead, Joe.
It was merely a placeholder until we could find the details from the state. We're not advocating 90 feet. That was just the highest number that we thought would be, the state might come back with. Then we later found out that the state had details of when they approved Cumberland Farms, how high that particular sign was. And we'd be happy to change the warrant to, as Jim suggests.
Go to the 75. Okay. All right, any other comments, questions?
I would just comment, I think it's the town's decision. I think the 70 and 75 feet change is important because I think that's appropriate. But beyond, and I would agree, I'd like to hear from the town council that it isn't spot zoning because it appears there's a multiple number of parcels that are available to do this. And I would support that we bring it to the town and make it their decision.
Okay, so my turn. I'm kind of torn on this, and with all due respect to Clear Channel and the applicant, I really don't like billboards. I don't think they're visibly pleasing. I do actually like digital billboards better than traditional billboards. So we're talking about pre-existing signs and improving those. I would, support the conversion to digital billboards. But we're talking about new signs or new sign, singular. And, when we talk about zoning, we're not talking about zoning to benefit one property. We're talking about zoning to benefit an area or, a section of town that might benefit from the zoning change. And so I think this classifies for that. I think there's several properties that will benefit. Again, only one will probably get developed and the rest will not benefit, but I do think all of them will have the opportunity to benefit and negotiate with the potential contractor to put a sign up. The question really comes whether the town wants to allow more of these digital billboards or one more of these digital billboards. And, I think given that they're facing the highway and not close to residential neighborhoods. There's, very little spillover, but also given the benefits to the town and, the yearly fee paid by Clear Channel, that will help small business grants. I understand that's supposed to go into the EDC grant program, or at least the current fee does. And the tax revenue, which is substantial. I believe the current valuation for the existing digital billboard on the Cumberland Farms property is, I think it's $3 million, which is a substantial amount of tax revenue for a very small square footage. The base of the sign is pretty small. So I think it's pretty high tax revenue that we'd be getting. And also the public benefits, as far as the public announcements and advertising for events like Arts in Common, which is this weekend. So I'm really, I guess I'm leaning towards what Jim's position. I'd like to have the town weigh in on this and have the opportunity to either vote it up or down. I do want to hear from council to confirm that it's not spot zoning, but I think, I'm convinced that it's not. I don't know. I've gone back and forth on this, and I don't want to let my personal aversion to billboards eliminate an opportunity for the town to generate revenue at what I think is very, minimal impact on the residents. So that's where I'm leaning, is at least to bring this to town and let the voters decide. All right. Any other questions before we go to the public? Jim?
Just to inform the board, just for more information. So town council did make comments on the body of this proposal, not on the intent, but on the language in the proposal. And I'd like to be able to give the applicant the opportunity to take a look at that. He has not gotten back to me on the spot zoning question. But any changes to this article, whether they're just editorial from council or intent by the board changing the height of the sign, et cetera, will have to be made at town meeting floor because the warrant will be set tonight. That said, it makes it more cumbersome to make those changes on town meeting floor. And from a planning perspective and from an economic development perspective, I think it's good to get the tax revenue from the sign. I was just asking Mike about who pays the taxes. I think it's a good thing that we get the tax revenue. I think it's a great thing that we get the payment to the town, the annual payment to the town for the EDC's budget or for the town's use. But I would hate to see the article fail on town meeting floor because the changes are significant. And let me ask the proponent, because if you refer this to committee, it can come back at the next town meeting. How critical is this that it be made now as opposed to March?
Well, it's much more advantageous. The economy right now supports this type of thing. We've put a lot of time into trying to do our best to form it in the way that the town has guided us to do so. So I would say it would be much more advantageous to have it in October rather than in the spring.
So if it fails because of a lack of understanding, because remember this is 2/3 majority required, so 1/3 of the people voting no defeats it. I just don't want that to happen to you. So I just bring those points up to the board.
I think that's a great point. And, again, I don't know what the rush is. I feel like this was another article that came to us last minute. And I understand the economic benefits of getting this done sooner rather than later. But from a zoning standpoint, I don't like feeling rushed in our decisions. I feel a little rushed on this decision. And so I'm so torn on this. All right.
But I would say that we began talking about this in March or April of this year, unlike the one I know that I happened to be here for the last one, and they brought it in August or September.
Yeah, but it didn't come to the rest of the board until just recently, and consequently, we had no information about this and didn't know about it. And I think rushing into zoning changes is something that we just as a board should not be doing. And 6 months, well, maybe we'll have some more answers to this question. I still, at this point, until I have more information, I'm not comfortable
5 months.
with voting to even send this to town meeting.
I would like to comment, I don't feel rushed on this article.
Okay.
I feel like we've been well informed. I agree on the last one, not on this one.
And one more thing is that this only creates optionality for the Board of Selectmen. This doesn't allow anything by right. Any proposal still has to go to the Board of Selectmen and be, fully vetted. They can say no. There's no by right billboard in here. The Board of Selectmen has to like the deal, like the idea, like the billboard. And the placement of it, the size of it, everything has to be.
So the Board of Selectmen will have the authority to deny a permit for a sign?
That's the way that's the way it's written, as I recall.
Could we ask counsel for an opinion on that?
Mr. Chairman, a comment?
Yeah, Tim, go ahead. Tim,
Like Jim, I have all the information I need, subject to the town council ruling it's not spot zoning and the height restriction, which would be in there. And then, I came to the table tonight hoping that we could let the town decide because of the tax revenue and because of the other benefits. I don't think that this is a referendum, as I said, on billboards. This is about making a change or proposing a change that the town can decide on. And I don't think there's anything new to be studied about it. Again, subject to those two things.
all right, we've discussed this a little bit. I'd like to hear from the public. If there's someone from the public okay, Jody, please. Restate your name and address for the record, thanks.
Sounds not.
Jody Hensley, 39 Arch Street. I have a content question, and I was wondering if Clear Channel would honor Westborough's prohibition on commercial marijuana commerce and not advertise cannabis on billboards in Westborough and comply with state law that does not allow billboard advertising for marijuana and cannabis to reach an audience that is greater than 15% under age 21. I share Mark's sentiment about billboards, but mostly lately, while cannabis billboards are proliferating in many regions in the state, we have community coalitions trying to tackle this state compliance with the state law and not getting very far with it. For a number of complicated reasons. But I guess my question is, would Clear Channel honor Westborough's prohibition on marijuana commerce and comply with state law restricting advertising on cannabis, especially right here within Westborough?
We do currently abide by the state law concerning cannabis advertising. And if the bylaw was passed and a petition was approved, it could be a stipulation that the town not allow us to advertise cannabis at all. That's up to you to put that proviso in there.
And it could be addressed by the selectmen at the select board as well, when the contract is signed regarding content and fees. And I did find in C, the select board.
So I guess, I think to Jim's point, the more changes we make to the article that's published in the warrant, the more difficult, well, that could be a change if we wanted to build language into the bylaw. If we wanted to just leave it up to the selectmen to put a stipulation on it.
Because the select board has complete discretion. They have to find that this is good for the town. That's their complete discretion, the way this warrant is written. If the select board determines that it provides a public health, provide a public health benefit to the town.
Jim Robbins, did you have a?
Yeah, my zoning enforcement officer is here. I'm going to ask him to brainstorm on this because this just occurred to me. You have a medical marijuana bylaw and you have a recreational marijuana bylaw in town, and there are restrictions on advertising. You cannot advertise outside of a dispensary in Westborough that distributes medical marijuana, and there's no allowance for recreational marijuana, period. So even if you had a medical marijuana facility, you could not advertise off premises currently in our current bylaw. So I assume that Clear Channel would respect that. So if the sign were in Westborough, you could not advertise any marijuana use.
Correct.
Any marijuana. Fred?
So Fred,
I'll give you some exercise.
This is aside from the moratorium that the town voted on. This is actual zoning bylaws that were passed prior to the moratorium, right? I believe that's true.
Fred Lenaro, zoning enforcement. I guess I don't know exactly what your question is. Sorry.
Would the current recreational marijuana and medical marijuana bylaw prevent cannabis advertising on an off-premise billboard such as proposed?
To be honest with you, Mark, I haven't looked at it. I don't have that in front of me. We've had so little dealings, actually virtually none, since I've been here in town. So it hasn't been a concern of mine. I've never looked at it. I would suggest to the board, though, if there's going to be restrictions, it wouldn't be appropriate to just rely on the select board to put those restrictions in, because the board may understand the intent of the bylaw now, but they certainly won't from years from now. So if you're going to explicitly prohibit any type of advertising, it should be so stated. It'd just make it easier for the board, just to give them carte blanche. They probably wouldn't even address it because they wouldn't even think about it.
Right.
Only in my opinion, from a zoning
I would certainly like a legal opinion on that. I mean, whether you can legally prohibit.
Well, more importantly, I'd like Fred to look into whether the current marijuana bylaws would prohibit that, and then there wouldn't be any need to build that into this bylaw. Right, but I just know that town officials are not in charge of enforcing state law, and if we have a bylaw on the books that a town official can enforce, I feel more confident that it will be appreciated by the voters. Fred, do you want a minute and I can?
Sure.
Okay.
That'd be
Is there
great.
anyone else
Thanks.
from the audience that wants to address the board on this? Anyone from the public? Sir, please just come up and state your.
Question. I didn't hear what the red hash marks mean.
Sir, I'm sorry. Could you just say your name and?
John Bartolini, I own the property that's in the yellow, but I don't know what
The red hash marks mean that particular parcel, the red hash marks mean that particular parcel is too close to a residential district by our reckoning and is not a candidate to have an electronic.
Still getting zoned, it's just not.
If that parcel went for the permit and it was within 200 feet of a resident, if any part of the parcel was within 200 feet of a residential district, then it wouldn't be eligible for approval. Well,
The zoning passes, everything in yellow.
Can you show the map again? John, can you just come up to the microphone just so that we can hear you?
Microphone.
Okay.
That's the only question I had, I didn't really hear.
well, it's our understanding that the parcels with the red hash marks are either abut or are within 200 feet of a residential lot, and therefore are not eligible to have an electronic billboard. The ones that are in solid yellow do not abut a residential parcel, nor are they within 200 feet. So our belief is the solid yellow parcels are eligible for an electronic billboard.
Well, no, I mean, the change in the zoning would really only impact the solid yellow. The portions in yellow meet some of the criteria, but not all of the criteria. So the one criteria that they don't meet is the proximity to the residential parcels. So that would eliminate those parcels with the red hash from eligibility for a digital billboard.
Yeah, for example, you can see that the parcel right along 495, which is on Washington Street, that goes all the way down to Flanders. I'm familiar with that parcel, and it has solar panels on it. But it's right across the street from all those residences. So that, it is not eligible under the way this warrant lays out.
Not eligible, but still.
Can't hear you.
It's not eligible because it still didn't get zoned because of the proximity to 495 and the master.
And the residential uses.
Residential is qualify it if
Yes.
I think what we really need is, we really don't need the red hash marked parcels on the presentation to the town, because it just seems to be a little bit misleading, because those parcels don't meet the criteria of the zoning change.
So what we tried to show is all the parcels that abut the Mass Pike or 495 and were in the industrial IB, IC, ID districts. But then we took a further look, and it wasn't so, we had to use our judgment to see which ones would fail based on the fact that they're within 200 feet of a residential parcel.
So I might recommend a layered approach to that, starting with all the parcels and then maybe superimpose a slide with, we had to take these parcels out because they're too close to residential. Because I think, there is some confusion about.
But we haven't measured, so. We haven't, this is just our reckoning. And this is not law, this is just an example of what we think.
Eligible because it's in industrial.
In our opinion.
You're going to have to speak up. I'm getting the indication no one can hear you.
In our opinion, the ones that are hashed red are within the 200 feet of a residential parcel. And some are obvious, some abut the residential parcels.
I think the chairman's right. You should eliminate the hash marks.
Yeah, just eliminate all those lots.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not changing the zoning for an area, right? We're changing the zoning for signs. So signs can be allowed if they meet this type of sign can be allowed if they meet a checklist of criteria. One of the checklists is they have to face or abut a major highway, right? All of those yellow parcels abut a major highway. The next checklist is they cannot be closer than 200 feet, right? by the proponent's judgment, the ones in red are closer than 200 feet to a residential, right? So the actual determination of that would be made most likely by the building commissioner, right? Once that sign was applied for, right? So if someone came in, if this passed and someone came in on any parcel in town and applied for a digital billboard, the building commissioner or somebody from the building department would determine whether it met that criteria that's set forth in the bylaw. It would almost certainly have to be one of the parcels in solid yellow, though. That judgment wouldn't be made until the application for the sign was actually in the building commissioner's office. Fred, I'm speaking for you on that, but am I right on that?
So specifically, if there's a requirement for a separation from a residential lot or zone, then yes, that would be covered and be addressed in the actual permitting, if that's what you're stating, yes.
That's what I'm asking, is you wouldn't, no one can really know if any of these parcels meet the criteria until they actually apply for a sign and you make a judgment on it.
That's a fair assessment, yes.
Okay. Does that make sense?
But turning that around, there may only be two places on this where it actually would meet all the criteria. So, I mean, that's one of my big hangups about this, quite frankly, is no one has answered me as to where exactly, and there may be only one or two places where this billboard can actually be put, because otherwise, all the other places either are not feasible because there is greenery along the middle of the road. They have to have a place where there's no obstruction on the midpoint of the road, so because they want a billboard that can be seen from people going either north or south. Plus, there may be other restrictions which we already have as far as the zoning goes. So there may be one spot. I don't care how many properties you have listed here, but there may only be one or possibly two spots where this billboard could actually go. And that's a question that I have not had answered.
If I may speak to that. So billboards, as you know, is our business, so we don't go to locations where we feel it's not going to meet either the local community's criteria or the state's. So I've driven up and down 495 numerous times, looking for like the on and off ramps, tree issues. You have to be within 500 feet of two commercial properties. We don't want to be in somebody's backyard shining on the neighborhood. So I can tell you now there's at least 3 or 4 locations, and they're really located close to each other, that do meet the criteria. And as I mentioned, if one gets approved, then that'll disqualify the other 2 or 3.
Well, obviously, but, okay, well, I still would like to know, I mean, as I said, I would like to know where exactly that's going to go. I mean, if it's going to be on.
So Hazel, the problem is.
This does not pertain to the zoning, so
Right, and the problem is we don't even know if any of those spots qualify until there's actually an application in, right? They're speculating that these yellow areas will meet the criteria.
Well, then why are we changing the zoning? I mean, why do you put a zoning article forth when there may be no use for it whatsoever?
Well, I think there's a reasonable assumption that you're going to get one sign out of this.
Well,
because there's some fiscal benefits to the town.
Putting a new code, the zoning, to benefit one sign, anyway.
Okay, can we hold on one second, because this gentleman had a comment, and could you just state your name, please? I'm sorry.
The way I read it, it's 1,000 feet from another sign or 200 feet from a residential area. Sign, not the lot.
Yeah, you're correct.
Correct.
Yes.
Well, that would make a huge difference in the bylaw. Can we clarify that?
does say the sign, actually, not the lot. So it's possible some of the ones with the red marks are big enough that they could be adjacent to a residence, but not within 200 feet. So there could actually be more candidates.
All right, so that just opened up a whole can of worms for me. Why? Because I don't want 5 signs popping up all the time.
They can't because of 1,000 feet. The 200 feet is where the sign can't be within 200 feet of a resident.
Well, yeah, but what if
It still can't be within
a
1,000
sign
feet.
goes up here and another one goes up here? That's 1,000 feet away.
So if I may speak to that?
Yeah.
It goes across the highway to the 1,000 feet. So if you had one, say, here, you couldn't put one here, 1,000 feet, 1,000 feet. So it's on both sides of the highway, that law applies.
Right, but you have parcel 317 or 165 or whatever that number is in red, right? Well, what you're saying is that if the sign in that parcel is 200 feet from a residential area and 1,000 feet from another sign, then 500 feet from an intersection, then in actuality, you could probably put a sign on whatever that 165, 317-0 parcel is, right? But then you could then go up to 150 or 2,000, which that's probably 1,000 feet from the sign, right? Because it's, I mean, that 317 probably has 1,000 feet of frontage alone.
Yeah, you have to also be within 500 feet of 2 commercial businesses.
And then the Cumberland Farm sign is near there, too.
Wow, I'm getting confused. I
Can-
think
can
the
perhaps-
problem is the more confusing this gets, the less likely it is to pass. All right, Jim, you got a comment?
So what I was just going to suggest is that we read item A under the, item C under the new proposed section 3340, because that, I think, will clear up some of the concern for how close do you have to be to a residential property, because it doesn't read that way. So if you read item C, which is at the bottom of page 7 on your warrant, item C says off-premises digital billboard signs may be allowed on commercial or industrially zoned, specifically within IA, IB, IC, ID overlay, and the BA highway business properties directly abutting Interstate Route 90, the Massachusetts Turnpike, or Interstate 495, if such digital billboard sign will not be situated within 200 feet of a residential district, and further, off-premises digital billboard sign shall not be permitted within 1,000 feet of another off-premises digital billboard sign on the same side of the traveled way, regardless of which direction the sign is intended to face, or may be permitted within 1,000 feet of another permitted off-premises digital billboard sign on the opposite side of the traveled way, regardless of which direction the sign is intended to face. I won't read the rest because it refers to the state regulation. So what that means is the billboard itself, the footing of the billboard, can't be within 200 feet of a residential district. So a large parcel, like the one at the bottom of the screen, parcel 165, could contain a digital billboard as long as the billboard is far enough away from that residential district on Washington Street. However, if there's another digital billboard on the opposite side of 495 within 1,000 feet, that would restrict that location. So you've got to look at both sides of 495, and you've got to look at the siting and its distance to a residential district. So all those parcels along Washington Street are in a residential district. But that won't happen until someone submits an application for the building permit. There's going to have to be an engineered plan, and the engineer's going to have to look at all of these criteria, and he's going to have to draw a box as to where that billboard can be sited. I assume that's what you'd want, something like that, Fred. He'd
Well,
want an
then
engineered
doesn't it
plan.
make sense to, I mean, it makes more sense to me if that the application be done or the work be done first before you try to change the zoning law, so you know what the effect is. So that's why I would see passing this over till March and do the research in between to see where or what is the feasibility of doing something like this is.
So I just looked this up, and that 165 is the Cumberland Farms where the existing digital billboard is. So we already know there's a billboard there. So that eliminates quite a few parcels on both sides. But I still think you could put a sign on like 2321 that's 1,000 feet away from the existing sign and potentially 200 feet from residential. I mean, I feel like there's a potential for more than one sign with this bylaw. And I'm not comfortable with that. I get back to my point. I don't want to see a bunch of these signs popping up. And I think there is a risk of that. So I would say that, you know, we need to figure this out before I can, you know, move it to town meeting or recommend it to town meeting. You know, I realize we can't hire an engineer on this, but I just feel like there's still too much in the air, you know, too much potential for a bunch of signs to show up.
I think my client could do a little bit of work to show how this would all lay out, the specific lots, if the planning board would be interested in knowing that.
Yeah, I just don't know if, again, we have a time constraint here, and I don't want to introduce a bunch of changes to the warrant article on town meeting.
Well, the only change that we've really talked about with specificity is the height.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can't go to town meeting, town warrant without doing the sort of thing that, I mean, you just said, fine, your client would be willing to do some work on this. Well, we can't sit around and wait and try to deal with this prior to this particular town meeting. It doesn't make sense.
I only was going to answer the planning board's inquiry and probably be prepared for town meeting inquiries about these specific facts. I'm not stating or suggesting that we would change the bylaw based on what our engineering found, but you could change your opinion based on what our engineering would find.
So we don't have to close a public hearing tonight if we wanted to give them an opportunity to research this a little more and come back to us with some more definitive locations. And
I quite frankly would like to wait till March. I see no reason to make this decision for this town meeting.
Yeah, thank you. Fred Leonardo, zoning. So as far as the cannabis, the bylaw, in reading, the way I would read it is that would prohibit a business in town from advertising on that as off-street or billboard, but it doesn't necessarily prohibit cannabis advertising. So it doesn't mean that they couldn't advertise to a business that's not in town, the way I read that. Now, even if there's a state requirement, then one, it'd be virtually impossible for me to enforce that, and two, it'd be up to the state, and I have no idea how they enforce that. You know, now you're getting into how they would enforce content. I don't know if the state approves content. Clear Channel would have a better idea of that than I would.
Jody, did you have a comment?
Legislature law that said there shall be no advertising of cannabis in audiences that are greater than 50%. The onus has been put on the cannabis driving down the highway are 85% over the age. So Mark, you bring up a whole thing that we can't enforce. So I guess that's why I turned to Clear Channel and said, can we ask not put those advertisements in a community where 80% of
Right, so as I mentioned earlier, we do comply with the state regulation concerning cannabis. And what does that mean? Do you have cannabis billboards? We have our own internal controls. We do advertise cannabis in certain locations that do qualify.
There it is.
Yes.
What data do you use?
I can't,
Okay.
I can get that for you
Okay,
if you want it.
We're getting a little bit back and forth. It's not the intent of the.
Shows up on billboards.
Your point is taken, though, Jody. Okay. All right. Thank you, Fred, for that somewhat ambiguous clarification.
Can I say one thing about cannabis? Last thing. So if this bylaw was passed and we came before the board for a certain location, you can put that a proviso in there stating, saying that we don't want, even though it might be allowed by state, if you said you can't put cannabis advertising on there as proviso and make that the condition, we would say yes. So you can make all these stipulations if you wanted to, even though the law allows
Right.
that certain type of advertising.
Yeah, again, I agree with Fred's point that asking the selectmen to adhere to this policy in perpetuity is, I mean, I think if we really want, if the town really wants that in the, to be enforced, it needs to be in the bylaw. And the more changes we make to the bylaw, I will say the less likely it is to pass. And that's from experience. If we introduce a bylaw that's drastically different than what was written in the warrant, we're going to be there for 5 hours and it'll get voted down almost certain. I can't say that with certainty, obviously. I'm just.
But if the changes are from the town's attorney, I'd imagine they're not controversial changes.
Yeah, but volume of changes matters too. And I think that, the problem with a lot of these warrant articles is people nitpick the language of them. And if you start introducing new language that people haven't had a chance to see, we're going to end up with 10 different amendments on the floor. And I personally think we need to fine tune the product before we bring it to town meeting, if we bring it to town meeting. But, I would like to analyze the location issue first, because I really need confidence that we're not going to result in
Clear Channel's looked at this and could easily provide you some guidance about what of the restrictions affects which lot. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would like to see some, more analysis on that than this technical drawing that you presented. Did you
It's not too technical because I produced.
Put those red lines on, Jeff? All right. I'm just joking with you. Sorry. All right. Any other questions or comments? Public? Anyone? All right. So I will leave it up to the board then, how we wish to proceed. Do we want to we have some options. We could leave the public hearing open and take this up at our next meeting with possibly some more information. We can close the public hearing and make a motion to either support, recommend, or defeat, or refer to committee or defeat. I mean, there's some options. So
I'm inclined to extend and get some more of this information so that we could feel stronger about one or the other at the next.
yeah, Pete, you were nodding your head. Do you want to comment or?
I agree that we extend so we get more information of the locations and just hammer this out so we feel more comfortable that we're not going to have multiple signs on this road.
Hazel, your thoughts?
Well, the thing is, if we hold open the public hearing, the warrant's closing tonight. So, I think we need to make a recommendation of some sort. And
Still make a recommendation.
Make the recommendation.
Yeah, and I'm not in favor of doing this at this time because I don't think we've done the necessary studying. I don't think holding open the public hearing for a week is going to make any difference at this point.
It might not make a difference, but it doesn't preclude us from referring it back to committee at next week's planning board meeting, if we still have open questions. Right, we could continue the public hearing, and then at our next meeting, October 5th, when we resume this discussion, if we still don't have the answers, if these answers haven't been satisfied to the satisfaction of the board, or whatever I'm trying to say, then we can discuss whether we want to refer it back to committee, or not us, but recommend that it be referred back to committee. So I don't see, I personally don't see the harm in leaving it open and giving them a chance to answer some of the questions we raised tonight. And I'd like to hear from Tim Kaler on what his thoughts. Tim, you with us?
My thoughts are that, yeah, we can hold open the public hearing. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
We should hold open
the public hearing.
We should hold open the public hearing. We should make every effort to move to recommend this to town meeting voters this fall. As a practical matter, the applicant would have to then petition the state, and then it has to come back to the select board. So I think it's important to move on this one way or the other. I don't think there's that many open questions in my mind. So where these locations, if we could narrow that down, where the potential locations might be, and that would satisfy people.
All right.
Then I'd be all for that.
Thanks, Tim. All right, so I will make a motion then to continue the public hearing to October 5th at 6:30.
I second that.
Any discussion? All those in favor, we'll do a roll call. Tim Kaler?
Yes.
Pete Bouchard?
Yes.
Hazel Nurse?
Yes.
Jim Ball?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. That's 5-0 to continue to October 5th.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, is there any other business on the agenda? I should know because I'm the chair, but I don't. I think that's everything, right?
Good luck.
Water discussion.
We did that, and you and Hazel will be having a discussion on that. All right, then. Jim, Kristen, anything else? No minutes, right?
No, we did that last week.
Jim, any other business?
No further
Announcements,
business,
anything?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Jim and I will be at the Finance Committee on Monday night to discuss these articles, and we'll let them know, give them an update on where we're at. But with that said, I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Hazel seconded. All those in favor, just raise your hand on this one. Tim, I think your hand's raised. Yeah. That's 5-0.
All right.